What does it actually mean when someone who once held every piece of your emotional world goes completely silent for 3 months, 6 months, maybe more? And if they were attached to you, if they once said things that sounded like forever, if they once looked at you like no one else existed, then how can the absence feel so total? How can someone who made you feel chosen suddenly make you feel like you never mattered at all? That is the question that keeps you awake at 2 a.m. That is the question you replay every time your phone lights up with a name that is not theirs. Because if they could leave so completely, maybe the version of them who loved you only existed inside your own imagination. Maybe you were clinging to a person who was already halfway out of the door. And maybe the silence you have been waiting to break is not silence at all. Maybe it is the truth finally surfacing. And the truth is that you were never loved the way you thought you were. But here is something that will rearrange your entire understanding of what happened. Silently disappearing from someone does not prove emotional indifference. It proves attachment pattern. Proves the way someone learned long before they ever met you that closeness is dangerous, connection is suffocating, and emotional need is a trap that should be escaped before it swallows them whole. The avoidant does not go quiet because they have finished grieving the relationship. They go quiet because that is how they survive the first wave. They go quiet because their nervous system is telling them that if they feel it now, they will not make it through. And so they leave, or they fade, or they pretend to leave. They tell themselves a story that the relationship ended because of reasons, timing, circumstance, incompatibility. They do not tell themselves the real story. The real story is that when intimacy got too close, they activated a defense system older than the relationship itself. Think about what it feels like inside an avoidant person during this phase. They are not grieving the way you imagine. They are not lying in bed, replaying memories. They are running on relief. They feel lighter. They feel clearer. They feel like they can finally breathe. And that relief is the part that hurts you the most when you eventually find out, because you are drowning in the silence and they are breathing easier without you. That feels like inequality of pain. That feels like you were abandoned by someone who was ultimately unburdened by your absence. And that is the version of the story you carry when you sit in your own silence waiting for proof that you mattered. But the relief an avoidant feels is not resolution. It is not peace. It is physiological downregulation. It is the nervous system resetting itself after weeks or months of hypervigilance. They have been feeling the pressure of your expectations, your emotional reach, your attempts to feel them, your need for closeness and reassurance. For an avoidant, that pressure registers as threat. Not because it is dangerous, because their earliest wiring taught them that love turns painful, inconsistent, or suffocating. So when they finally deactivate, what you see on the outside as cold indifference is actually a deeply wired self-protective shutdown. They are not ignoring you. They are ignoring the part of themselves that would otherwise have to acknowledge how much you matter to them. And that is the first layer of the revelation. The avoidant silence is not proof of their detachment. It is proof of their emotional capacity being overwhelmed. Their nervous system hit its threshold. Their subconscious decided that emotional distance was the only way to stay functional. They did not erase you from their memory. They placed you in the safest room of their internal world and closed the door. The door closes first. The reawakening comes later. And what most people never understand is that the door does not stay closed forever. It only stays closed until something inside them changes. Until their emotional landscape softens. Until the memory of you stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like what their body was actually missing. That is the part you were never supposed to believe if you only knew the silence. You were told that silence means letting go. You were told that no contact means they have replaced you. You were told that if they really cared, they would not have the ability to disappear so cleanly. But none of that is what is happening underneath the surface. None of that is what avoidant attachment actually looks like in the deeper layers. The silence that feels like rejection is the silence of a person who is too overwhelmed by closeness to even admit to themselves that they need it. They do not go silent because they do not care. They go silent because caring at that moment feels like the most emotionally expensive thing they could ever do. And then the months stretch. They feel longer than they should. You start checking your own narrative. You start wondering if you made the whole connection up. You start wondering if what looked like love was actually just them trying on a version of themselves they never planned to keep. That is where most people lose themselves. They break their own confidence trying to interpret the silence. They shame themselves for still caring about someone who managed to walk away so surgically. They rewrite the entire relationship to make sense of the silence. And they never stop to consider that the silence might have less to do with how they felt about you and more to do with a defense pattern that existed long before you ever came into the picture. Here is the part that rearranges everything. Avoidants often do not process connection while they are inside it. They are too busy managing the threat of it. And once the relationship ends, the threat finally lifts. Distance becomes their decompression chamber. And inside that decompression chamber, something quiet begins to happen. Slowly, subtly, almost invisibly, their nervous system begins to settle. Their defenses begin to soften. The pressurized urgency to detach starts to fade. And as it fades, what was being suppressed begins to surface. Memory starts feeling safer. Emotion starts feeling less like a trap. And you, the person they shut out, start feeling less like a threat and more like what they unconsciously lost. That does not mean they immediately reach out. It means the ground is shifting beneath the silence. The door that closed first is loosening at its hinges. The version of you that they could not face in the heat of the moment is becoming the version of you they cannot stop thinking about in the safety of distance. Months of quiet are not months of forgetting. They are months of post-threat emotional processing that most people do not understand because they have only seen the silence from the outside. And this is where the deeper revelation begins. Because if silence is not forgetting, and if months of no contact is not indifference, then what exactly is the avoidant doing during that time? What is happening under the surface of their calm, controlled, emotionally curated distance? And more importantly, when they finally resurface, when they finally send the message, when they finally come back pretending nothing happened, what did that return actually mean? Was it real? Or was it just the door finally opening because the threat was no longer close enough to scare them? If you could see inside the avoidant's inner world during the months of silence, you would not see someone peacefully moved on. You would see someone whose nervous system has been quietly negotiating with itself. The version of them that looked composed, organized, focused, or even happy in the early weeks of separation is not a person who finished processing the relationship. It is a person who has temporarily disabled the part of themselves that would have to feel it. And that temporary disabling is what creates the visible appearance of someone who no longer cares. In the beginning, the avoidant often feels what looks like genuine relief. The emotional demands that were quietly building have disappeared. The pressure to respond, to reassure, to be emotionally available, to demonstrate closeness in the way their partner wanted, all of it lifts. And that lifting feels like freedom. It feels like they can finally think again. It feels like they have returned to themselves. They convince themselves that the relationship was the source of their overwhelm, and that without it they are whole again. Many avoidants enter this stage so intensely that they begin to subtly rewrite the entire history of what happened between you. They take the moments where they were flooded and reinterpret them as evidence that the connection was wrong. They take the moments where they pulled away and relabel them as strength instead of defense. They take the moments where they suppressed their love and call it self-preservation. And in doing so, they construct a version of the breakup that protects them from having to face how much they actually felt. But that version does not last forever. It is a story built to survive the acute phase of emotional shutdown, not the long-term phase of distance. As weeks turn into months, the original threat that activated their withdrawal grows quieter. Distance softens the memory of pressure. The urgency that once made closeness feel dangerous starts to dissolve. And what begins to surface underneath is the part of the avoidant that did feel something. The part that was not indifferent. The part that noticed your laugh, your loyalty, your patience, the way you ask questions most people never bothered to ask. That part does not disappear during silence. It waits. It sits in emotional storage. And as the threat fades, it slowly starts leaking back into consciousness. Now here is where the two deepest avoidant patterns begin to diverge. Because what happens inside a dismissive avoidant and what happens inside a fearful avoidant during these months is not the same. A dismissive avoidant tends to intellectualize the relationship. They minimize it, they reframe it as a learning experience. They archive you in their mind as something that mattered but is now behind them. They remain outwardly composed. They go on with their routines, their friendships, their hobbies, their distractions, often with a renewed sense of independence. And from the outside, it looks like they have genuinely moved forward. But underneath, the dismissal is a continuation of the same defense. They are not handling the emotion. They are rerouting it through logic and self-narrative. They tell themselves they are fine because the alternative is to admit that they cared more than they let you see. And that admission would dismantle the protective story they have been telling themselves since the moment intimacy started to feel heavy. A fearful avoidant, on the other hand, experiences these months as quiet emotional chaos. They do not move on cleanly, they oscillate. They miss you intensely, then shame themselves for missing you. They feel regret, then push the regret away. They think about reaching out, then convince themselves not to. They check your profile, then leave it. They feel the pull of closeness, but also the terror of it. This is the avoidant who privately replays conversations, remembers details they never told you they remembered, and carries emotional residue they cannot organize. Their silence is not peace. It is internal conflict with nowhere to go. They are not avoiding you. They are avoiding themselves. In both cases, time is doing something invisible. Time is taking the original emotional activation and slowly converting it from threat into memory. Time is moving you from the too much category in their subconscious and into the what if I lost that category. And that shift is critical because avoidants do not usually reach back out when the relationship still feels emotionally expensive. They only reach back out when the memory becomes safer than the feeling ever was. And that is exactly why distant avoidants sometimes return months later saying things that sound like they had a realization, when what actually happened is that the pressure that once made closeness unbearable has finally dissipated enough for them to access what they suppressed. There is also a deeper psychological process happening during these months that most people fail to recognize. Avoidants unconsciously need the person they deactivated from to remain emotionally retrievable in case their internal world requires reconnecting. That is why dismissals and silences are rarely final. They are deflections. The avoidant shuts the door, but they do not lock it in the way they would if they truly believed the relationship held no meaning. Somewhere inside, a part of them knows that this is not resolution. Somewhere inside, a part of them is watching the passage of time, waiting to see what rises. And what rises is usually not the conflict you had or the moment they walked away. What rises is the version of connection that their nervous system could not tolerate when it was happening live. Many avoidants do not even realize this is happening consciously. They will say they are over it. They will say they do not think about the relationship anymore. They will act like the months have erased it. And they will believe that for stretches of time. But then a song comes on, a smell, a location, a memory triggered by nothing at all, and suddenly the emotional door they closed begins to glow again underneath the surface. Because attachment memory does not behave like normal memory. It does not degrade with time. It reactivates under the right emotional conditions. And the longer the avoidant stays in silence, the more those conditions begin to build. This is why the months of quiet are not months of indifference. They are months of slow internal architectural change. The avoidant is rewiring their perception of you, from someone who represented emotional pressure to someone who represents emotional loss. And that change, even though it is invisible to you, is the engine behind what eventually makes them reach out. They are not coming back because you have changed. They are coming back because their relationship with the memory of you has changed. And that is the part most people never anticipate. They think the return will mirror the departure, sudden, clean, intentional. But the return is usually slower, softer, more confused. The avoidant comes back not because they decided to, but because they finally could. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in understanding avoidant psychology. A decision implies closure. A decision implies the previous distance was intentional, stable, and final. But an avoidant returning after months of silence is not usually acting from decision. They are acting from attachment withdrawal. Their system has been quietly registering your absence. Their subconscious has been testing what it feels like to live without the person they once told themselves they did not need. And now, with time softening the original threat, with distance diffusing the original pressure, with memory becoming safer than emotion ever was, something deeper has begun to wake up. Which raises the question the avoidant themselves rarely consider. They suppressed the connection during the relationship, ignored the emotional weight of it, dismissed your need for closeness, and convinced themselves that distance meant freedom. Then what changed inside them now? What psychological shift turned the version of you they could not face into the version of you they cannot stop thinking about? And if their return is not a decision but an attachment reaction, then what does that mean about the long-term stability of whatever follows when they finally reappear? There is a very specific emotional architecture that determines whether the avoidant lets you go quietly or begins to feel your absence like a weight. And the most important thing you need to understand about that architecture is that it is built long before they ever come back. It is built during the months of silence. It is built in the gap between your last conversation and their first message. It is built in the way you carry yourself when you stop being emotionally available, in the way you stop performing your devotion, in the way you stop reaching, and in the way you begin to reconstruct yourself outside of their reach. And that architecture is what eventually either pulls them back toward you or allows them to permanently leave. The first move that subtly makes the avoidant start to notice your absence is ending emotional overavailability. This is not about withdrawing affection in response to hurt. This is not about punishing them or staging a revenge silence. This is about no longer remaining in the background of their life as an open emotional channel that costs them nothing to ignore. Avoidants deactivate not because they have stopped feeling. They deactivate because they can feel you waiting. And as long as you remain emotionally accessible, their attachment system stays dormant. They know the door is open if they want it. They know you are still responsive. They know that even if they ignore you today, you will not become truly unavailable tomorrow. Your predictability reassures them. Your patience allows them to delay emotional reentry without losing the option of reentry later. So the first move is closing that open channel. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. When an avoidant senses that your emotional energy is no longer orbiting their decision-making, something subtle begins to shift. They start noticing the shape of your absence the way you noticed the shape of theirs. They begin running small internal checks. They begin wondering whether the person who used to reply instantly is now neutral. They begin wondering whether the person who used to absorb their mood shifts with grace has now redirected that grace into their own life. And that wondering matters. Because wondering is the earliest stage of attachment activation in an avoidant. Wondering is not yet longing, but it is the foundation longing stands on. Without wondering, an avoidant cannot begin to feel the loss. And without feeling the loss, the months of silence will continue to feel like successful emotional management rather than quiet deterioration of connection. So the first move is not to play coy. It is to genuinely stop offering the emotional labor that kept their deactivation comfortable. The second move is becoming less predictable without becoming reactive. This is the part that most people misunderstand. They think they need to construct a new personality that appears unbothered. That is not what this is. This is about becoming internally regulated inside your own life. It is the moment you stop checking whether they have seen your story. It is the moment you stop curating your posts around the question of whether they will notice. It is the moment you start making decisions based on your own rhythm rather than their psychological timeline. The avoidant is used to sensing that there is still a gravitational pull between you and them, even in silence. They are used to relying on the quiet emotional current that runs between two people who have not healed from each other. When that current weakens because your attention is genuinely shifting into your own growth, your friendships, your purpose, your sovereignty. They feel it, not logically. Attachment does not speak in logic. Attachment speaks in nervous system rhythms. And when the rhythm of your attention changes, their system registers it the way it would register the sudden withdrawal of a drug. This is important. Avoidants do not respond to visible performance of detachment. They respond to actual detachment. They can sense whether your silence is a strategy or whether your silence is your new state. They can sense whether your calm is a costume or whether your calm is real. And if they sense that your calm is real, the landscape of the dynamic changes. Because their attachment system has been built on the assumption that you will always remain emotionally accessible if they ever want to return. When you prove through your actual life, not through manufactured imagery of self-improvement, but through real internal anchoring to your own worth, that their access is no longer guaranteed simply because they once mattered, their nervous system begins to register vulnerability. And vulnerability in an avoidant does not show up as softness. It shows up as quiet recognition that something is missing. It shows up as the slow internal admission that the person they deactivated from may no longer be waiting. The third move is withdrawing the chase without withdrawing your value. And this is the move that most people fail at, because they interpret it as either becoming cold or becoming unavailable as a tactic. Neither is the answer. The answer is becoming a person whose standards for emotional reciprocity are no longer optional. It is the moment you stop pretending that their inconsistent presence is equivalent to actual connection. It is the moment you stop celebrating breadcrumbs because they are all you have. It is the moment you stop accepting silence, married to nostalgia, as a substitute for genuine emotional commitment. When an avoidant senses that your dignity has reasserted itself in a way they did not anticipate, something inside them begins to destabilize. Because their attachment map of the relationship assumed a particular layout. You stayed loyal, you stayed emotionally available, you remained hopeful. That layout kept them psychologically safe. It allowed them to deactivate without consequence. It allowed them to imagine that the connection would still be there in some retrievable form whenever they finish processing their avoidance. When that layout changes, when your dignity shifts the emotional terms of the dynamic, when you stop performing availability that was never reciprocated in the way you needed, the avoidant loses the safety net their deactivation assumed. They had told themselves the connection was waiting. They had told themselves you would still respond kindly if they came back months later. They had built the eventual return on the foundation that your devotion would not waver. And when they begin to suspect that foundation is not as solid as they believed, their internal world begins to crack, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to activate the part of their attachment system that monitors loss. And that is when the psychological groundwork for their return begins. This sequence matters. The first move removes emotional access. The second move removes predictability. The third move removes the illusion that the dynamic will remain indefinitely in your emotional favor. Together, these three shifts slowly dismantle the avoidant's internal assumption that they can deactivate without consequence. They reintroduce the fear of loss without recreating the original pressure that caused the withdrawal, which is the key insight. The goal was never to recreate pressure. The goal was to create genuine absence. Pressure makes an avoidant deactivate harder. Absence makes an avoidant reassess. And it is in that reassessment, not in any clever strategy, that the door they thought was locked begins to swing open. But this raises the deeper question that most viewers come to this video hoping to answer. If the avoidant begins to feel the loss now, and if their attachment begins to reactivate because your energy has changed, what happens when they finally reach out? What does it mean when months of silence end with a message that sounds like they have been waiting? What does it mean when the person who walked away suddenly seems reflective, tender, almost vulnerable? Is that their healed self finally emerging? Or is it their attachment system simply re-establishing contact with the only person whose emotional current they still recognize? Because there is a vast difference between an avoidant returning because they are ready for intimacy and an avoidant returning because their nervous system has finally rebalanced enough to let them feel what they shut off. And that difference may be the most important thing you ever learn about avoidant attachment. There is a moment every avoidant returning story has in common. The message lands. The phone lights up. The name appears, and for one split second, every unanswered question, every 2 a.m. doubt, every quiet humiliation of being silenced for months collapses into a single emotional flash. Relief. Validation. Proof that you were not crazy for holding on. Proof that the connection was real. Proof that the version of them you trusted was not a hallucination. And in that moment, you feel something close to euphoria. But what you are actually feeling is the relief of attachment uncertainty ending, not the beginning of a stable new dynamic. Because here is the truth most people do not want to hear at this stage of the story. The reason an avoidant comes back has very little to do with how they feel about you as a partner, and almost everything to do with how their attachment system has recalibrated during the months of distance. While you were waiting and rebuilding and questioning your perception of reality, they were not experiencing the same process. They were running a private, largely unconscious negotiation with the absence of you, and the avoidance machinery that powered their silence is the same machinery that now powers their return. It is not a different psychological engine. It is the same engine in reverse, reacting to a sudden shift in emotional pressure rather than a genuine transformation in their capacity for intimacy. This is why so many avoidant returns feel emotionally confusing at first. They sound tender, they sound reflective. They say things like they have been thinking about you, like they realize what they lost, like distance gave them clarity, like they have changed. And some of those words may even be true in that exact moment. But the moment is not the metric. The metric is what they are capable of holding when closeness resumes. And closeness is the environment in which the avoidant originally collapsed, which means that returning to closeness will not necessarily reveal their healed self. It will more likely reveal whether the conditions that caused their withdrawal have actually shifted internally, or whether the withdrawal was simply a phase of emotional suppression that has temporarily lifted. You cannot determine whether an avoidant has genuinely changed based on a message, a phone call, an emotional confession, or a sudden surge of nostalgia. You can only determine whether an avoidant has changed by watching what they do when closeness reintroduces pressure. Do they withdraw again? Do they suddenly become distant when you respond warmly? Do they start creating new reasons to slow the dynamic down? Do they begin deactivating the moment the relationship returns to a level of intimacy that requires sustained vulnerability? Because if they do, that is not evidence that they have not changed in some visible surface way. That is evidence that their underlying pattern has not been addressed, and that their return was powered by attachment activation rather than by emotional readiness. And the difference between those two possibilities will determine the long-term stability of whatever comes next. A return triggered by attachment activation looks softer than the original silence. It sounds like longing. It sounds like regret. It sounds like they have finally seen what they were risking. But underneath, the activation is simply responding to the fact that the emotional channel they once shut down has become available again. The avoidant is not returning to the relationship as a transformed partner. They are returning to the relationship as a person whose nervous system has been re-exposed to the same stimulus they spent months avoiding. And unless the internal architecture that deactivates under intimacy has been repaired, that stimulus will eventually trigger the same shutdown, possibly in a different form, possibly slower, possibly disguised as a busy schedule, a new emotional concern, a sudden pivot in priorities, or a quiet withdrawal of the intimacy that the early return felt so promising. But the pattern remains intact. This is why the most important moment in an avoidant return is not the message. The most important moment is the moment their emotional system decides that the activation is no longer safe. Many people describe this as the second discard. The avoidant returns, warms, integrates, grows visibly closer, and then quietly begins pulling back. And that pullback is not a betrayal of the new version of them. That pullback is the original wound, returning the same avoidance machinery they thought they had set down, but carried with them in their psychology the entire time. The deepest psychological reality behind avoidant returns is that avoidance rarely come back because they have learned to tolerate intimacy. They come back because distance made intimacy feel safer in retrospect. Distance did not change their capacity for love. Distance changed their proximity to emotional pressure. And the moment that pressure returns, because continued closeness brings expectation, vulnerability, accountability, and emotional visibility, the cycle reactivates. Many avoidants experience their return as a moment of clarity. Many partners experience their return as a second chance. But unless the avoidant has done internal work that restructured how their nervous system responds to closeness, the second chance is not a second chance at a different relationship. It is a second chance at the same relationship, simply with more emotional debt on both sides. And that realization is the emotional gateway to becoming a genuinely different kind of partner for yourself. Because the moment you stop mistaking return for transformation, you start measuring people by what they sustain instead of what they promise. You stop treating an opening message as evidence of growth. You stop interpreting temporary softness as permanent emotional availability. You start paying attention to follow-through. You start paying attention to consistency. You stop confusing the relief of attachment reconnection with the safety of emotional partnership. This is where detachment moves from being a strategy into becoming a form of self-respect. The reason you needed the absence in the first place was not to make the avoidant come back. The reason you needed the absence was to stop having your nervous system regulated by someone whose nervous system is built to deactivate. The reason you needed to stop overgiving, stop overreaching, stop centering your emotional architecture around their availability was not to provoke them into returning. It was to return to yourself. And if they reappear in that process, you are now emotionally equipped to evaluate them, not from a place of longing, but from a place of self-trust, which leads to the final psychological truth of this entire dynamic. The question was never really why the avoidant comes back. The question was why their return only felt meaningful once you stopped waiting. And the reason their return suddenly feels powerful, suddenly feels healing, suddenly feels like proof of love, is because you finally stop letting their absence define the worth of the connection. That is the real psychological shift. Not the avoidant realizing they lost something. You realizing you stopped losing yourself in the process. And when the relationship is rebuilt from that place, when the avoidant returns and finds that you are no longer the person who chased their inconsistency, no longer the person who treated their hesitation as sacred, no longer the person who mistook their emotional absence for a wound you had to keep trying to heal, then something different becomes possible. Because they are no longer returning to the version of you that enabled the pattern. They are encountering the version of you that revealed the pattern. And that version of you does not bend to keep them comfortable. That version of you does not collapse to keep them close. That version of you has already learned that the most important attachment is the one you build with yourself. The reason the avoidant comes back is rarely because they have changed. The reason they come back is because something in the dynamic shifted without them, and their attachment system registered the loss. But whether their return becomes the beginning of something real or the repetition of something familiar depends entirely on whether you are prepared to evaluate what they bring, not by the words of the return, but by the structure of what they are willing to sustain. That is the insight. That is the revelation. And from here, every interaction you have with an avoidant, whether they have returned or whether they are still in silence, will be evaluated not by how it feels in the moment it lands, but by what it is capable of becoming once the emotional rush fades. Because the rush is not the relationship, the consistency is. And consistency is the one thing the avoidant attachment style has always struggled to provide unless they have done the internal work that rewires their relationship with closeness itself. Which is why the deepest version of this entire journey is not about getting them back. It is about getting yourself back. And that is where every meaningful attachment story eventually finds its center.